For whoever's watching, whether you're watching this live with us now or later, I'm going to begin by thanking you so much for taking your time in this very busy online event and in the middle of your very busy life. Acknowledging that, I am going to recommend that we just take a moment and catch our breath together. You might already be relaxed from other sessions you're watching, or maybe you're watching a recording of this in the middle of a very busy day. So having said all that, why don't we take a moment, close our eyes, and connect with our breath. And breathing deeply in through the nose, I'm going to invite you to hold your breath for just a moment and notice what's going on inside you. Is there tension or tightness? And opening your mouth, breathing out that stress or that busyness, whatever you need to release right now. And we'll just repeat this cycle a few times, in through the nose gently, holding the breath for a moment just to become mindful of what's going on in our body, our being, and then letting the jaw relax and soften. We open our mouth to exhale long and fully. And from this place of quiet, may we each find a prayer of gratitude in ourselves. Gratitude for this moment of learning and listening. Gratitude for another day of life and the chance to love and let go. And gratitude for all the wisdom keepers of this world who have made it their work, their mission, and in some cases, their life purpose. Pass on the teachings and the practices that bring us home to our truth in spirit. May we each and all find our own prayers today and together say, Amen.
Amen.
Well, my name is Jonathan Ellerby. I'm the new Executive Director for Spirituality and Practice, and I am here with the person I fondly refer to as my boss. So Marianne and Frederick Brussat are the founders of Spirituality and Practice, a nonprofit that originally started under a different name almost 50 years ago, almost exactly 50 years ago. And it's taken many shapes and forms over the years, always connecting people to a deeper experience of life, a more fully engaged understanding of culture and purpose and meaning. But over the last 15 years, their possibly greatest expression has been a website called Spirituality and Practice. And this is a resource that we hope you're all checking out, because it's not only going to be helpful for what you do if you're involved in, compassionate care, compassionate listening, spiritual direction, companionship, and so on, but it's also just an unbelievable reservoir of tools and resources for people on the spiritual journey. So it's very easy to share what's there. Today is our chance to talk to Marianne about the foundation of this website, the hidden infrastructure, the secret behind the magic, which is the spiritual alphabet, or depending on how you approach it, spiritual literacy. So, Marianne, thank you so much for doing this with me,
Okay.
with us.
It's great to have this chance to talk together. We talk all the time, but this is a little different
It
conversation.
is.
I like to have a conversation. Yeah.
It's
Great.
great. So I think we should just dive in, if it's okay, now that I've done the
Sure.
big intro. So let's start off for people who are new to spirituality and practice and new to the spiritual alphabet. Could you just start by giving a little bit of an overview, a description? What is the spiritual alphabet? What do people mean by spiritual literacy? And what does it have to do with you and Frederick?
Okay. Well, so yeah, so just kind of the origin story, let me share, of the alphabet. So we wrote a book, put together a book called Spiritual Literacy in the mid to late 90s. And the book was a collection of over 650 short excerpts from books that we had read that illustrated what we would call a spiritual take on everyday life, a spiritual way to look at an experience. And there are chapters on places, on things, on animals, on community life, on various kinds of activities. And as we were gathering these little passages, all of this illustrative material, Frederick, who's the reader in the household, or the big reader in the household, would gather examples that he thought should go in the book, and he would read them to me. And I would say sometimes, well, that is really beautifully written, and I really love that thought. And but why is it spiritual? Why do you call it a spiritually literate take on the world? And he would say, well, because it's expressing wonder, or it's expressing gratitude, or it's playful. And the traditions the religious traditions all have play as part of their repertoire of things that people can do. And so I just started writing down a list of all these words. And eventually we came up with 37 of them. And in doing that, of course, the publisher thought, you can't have 37 in an alphabet. You need 26 in an alphabet. And we said, well, yeah, but you try to choose between joy and justice, or between peace and play, or teachers and transformation. So we settled on 37. And then Frederick went back and went through lots of quotes, lots of things that he's reading, and wrote descriptions of each of the alphabet practices. And along the way, as he was really fleshing out these ideas, we realized that they were really representing a whole multi-faith perspective on spirituality. It wasn't just coming out of one tradition, it was coming out of all of the traditions. So that's kind of how we came up with it. We included those descriptions that Frederick came up with in Spiritual Literacy in the book. And then we wrote another book called Spiritual RX, in which there's a chapter for each one of these alphabet practices. And of course, now, we'll probably get into this later, but now they're all over the website. So the website is really organized around those practices. Oh, you're muted.
I'm listening, and the first thing that comes to me is that, if it's a real alphabet, it gets to have as many letters as it wants, right? The Hebrew alphabet doesn't have 26.
Yes.
So much for Scribner, right? But one of the things that I'm interested in you speaking to that I think is both a strength, although maybe sometimes a point where people can get a little lost at the beginning of their exploration, is that really these are all both qualities and practices. In fact, I'm starting to think, I'm making notes over here, they're really qualities, experiences, and practices. And you can kind of enter it from any of those places. Is that the way you see it?
Well, I think we originally thought of them as practices, and but then it's interesting. There was a television series made in Canada based upon the book, and they organized it. The director organized it around 26, because that's a television season, is 26 episodes. But he called them qualities of the spiritual life. And he's Buddhist. And as we thought about it more and more, we began to recognize that, yes, these are character qualities, but they're also practices. So you can aspire for beauty, but you can also practice beauty.
Right.
You can aspire to be a forgiving person, but there are specific ways to practice forgiveness.
Right.
So I think it's both. And I do think that all of spirituality is a matter of experience.
Right.
And so definitely these are things that you experience. They're not just abstract concepts.
So another thing I really love about this is that, as a teacher myself and someone who speaks a lot, I have often found myself kind of wondering about the integrity of standing up in front of people again and again and always saying, now this is the most important thing. So today we're going to talk about hope. Hope's so important. And then a week later, justice. Oh no, justice is so important. And I have often wondered, gosh, is that confusing people? To say that there's one great starting place, not that I'm ever promising just one, but that it would be worthy. And what I love about the alphabet is in a clever way, it does present one thing, which is the alphabet. But within the one thing are 20 or 37 ways into it, 37 aspects of it. And really, each one does interconnect with all the other ones. Can you say a little something about the interconnection of the 37? If, for example, someone goes to our site and really just dives into one practice or one quality, does it inevitably lead to the others?
Well, I think it does. I think there's some practices that are more familiar to people of certain traditions. So I think that if you say take Christianity, you're going to be looking at, faith, forgiveness, love, certainly, nurturing, transformation, peace. And then there are some that are like connected to each other. So say you think about nurturing, self-care. Well, that's going to bring peace in the sense of peace of mind. There's also peace in the world. So at various times we've kind of tried to make links between them and like say, oh, well, in Judaism, you've got meaning because it's all about so often about text study, but it's also about play because it's a very playful aspect in a lot of the teachings. But today it feels as if it's more important to look at what people that aren't necessarily part of a tradition would gravitate to. And so what are those kind of, we see these as universal practices in all of the traditions, but they're also very, very easy to access by someone who would describe themselves as not affiliated with the tradition, right, or spiritual but not religious. So something like gratitude or wonder when you're out in nature or even something like beauty, those are easily accessible to anybody, no matter where you're coming from. But I do think that if you get going in a certain direction, you're going to naturally discover, just by reading book reviews and watching the coding that we've done, you'll discover connections between the practices. Yeah.
So I have two questions that come out of this. Let me start with a practical one, and this is more for people who are listening and maybe are going to go next to the website to check it all out. If someone wants to explore a practice or quality, an aspect of life or spirituality they'll want to embrace more, what can they expect to find? I mean, I kind of know the answer, but I'm interested in the way you articulate what is available to support the understanding of each letter of the alphabet?
Well, if you go to the website, spiritualityandpractice.com,
Yes.
under the navigation bar at the top, it says practices, and then you can see a list of all the practices. And if you go to those, it says the alphabet of spiritual literacy. If you go to each one of those pages, you're going to find a lot of a general definition of the practice, kind of some suggestions about why this one might be good for you. Like, what are the things that happen in your life that make you want to seek out to practice gratitude, or make you really interested in how enthusiasm might change the way that you approach your life. So then we have collections. We've curated our content. So we have books to recommend. We have movies that are illustrative. We have spiritual practices that fit in that you can do. And the reason we do it that way is because we feel that the ability to find the sacred in your daily life, which is what spiritual literacy means, to be able to read the world from a spiritual perspective, you need illustrations. This is, I can't just say to you, well, do this or do that. You need to see how others have done it. You need to see how people have expressed it, have talked about it. You need to see some practices. And so the whole concept of this website really is just like one big reservoir of illustrations of beauty, of transformation, and that's why I see the alphabet as such an important bridge. I've talked to you about this before, but it's like, first of all, we know that all of these 37 qualities or practices are common in all the world's religions. So it's a bridge between religions. You can talk to Muslims and Jews and Christians, and they can all talk about transformation. Right. So it's a bridge between traditions, but it's also, as I mentioned a minute ago, a bridge between those who are part of a tradition and those who don't associate with a religion. And those people, then it's a bridge to the spiritually unaffiliated from the traditions. Then I think one of the most interesting things is that it's a bridge to our culture and to the expressions in our culture. So we can look at any movie, and we do this. When we look at a movie, we say, okay, what does this illustrate? Mm-hmm. A lot of movies are about transformation. By the end of the film, somebody's been transformed. Mm-hmm. A lot of movies are about love. A lot of movies are about shadow and acknowledging the shadow in our experience. And so it's a bridge to the pop culture, these alphabet practices. And then one of the things we've learned recently, working with a project that we're doing with the Fetzer Institute on practicing democracy, we set out to identify practices that will enhance the democracy. And one of the first things we discovered is that everybody was concerned about polarization. How do you talk to people who you don't agree with? And we discovered that, these same character qualities can be bridges across these divides. So take something like reverence, which is the practice of respect. Now, you can be, a young, progressive person who wants to and is at dinner with someone who is, an elderly uncle or something. And both people want respect. They want to have their ideas respected. They want to be listened to. They may define respect a little differently, but that's what they want. And so respect or reverence becomes a bridge across divides.
Yes. It's great. It's so great, and it's funny because I told you I had two questions that I wanted to pursue, and you started to touch on one of them, and it has to do with the idea of reading the book of life.
Mhm.
And this is, as you know, a very old concept. From the earliest times there were books, mystics started to use that as a metaphor um, for the way one who is awakening to mystical consciousness or spiritual consciousness is able to read all the events. And just as, for people who might be attending the SDI event, in this morning's talk, and I, her full name better than I.
Sister Joan Chittister.
I don't say
Sister
the
Joan
last.
Chittister.
Chittister. I didn't want to say that. Sister Joan Chittister. She talked about how even in ancient texts, there's evidence that spiritual guides have been telling us that it's not all in physical books, it's not all in worship services, that it's literally in the world around us all the time. That
Mhm.
God is like a text that is everywhere waiting to be read. So I wonder if you could say a little more about, well, I guess a couple of things. The concept of the book of life and the spiritual alphabet unlocking our ability to see it and feel it. But if you could add a little color and talk about what was it like when this was unfolding for the two of you? Because I think to go from just organizing things in piles to suddenly realizing you have an alphabet that introduces the metaphor and experience of language, communication, vision, the world as a book, I would think that was a very exciting moment.
It actually still is,
Yeah.
because what happens to is that we start hearing these words in talks that people give, spiritual talks that we listen to, or we're reading a book and when we suddenly discover that there's whole chapters devoted to these qualities and practices that we identified 25 years ago, or 20, yeah, around there, 20. And the thing about it is that this idea of reading the book of life, I love the fact that when you have in the Native American tradition, when someone goes out into the woods, they're reading sign, they're looking for signs and trying to understand what this aspect of nature might be saying to them. And in Islam, you have the concept that Allah is constantly, everything is happening is a letter from God to us. But I also think that the revelation, to me at least, was that when you start that spiritual literacy actually becomes an entire way of life.
Yes.
Because everything that happens is either a sign or a sample or a symbol or some aspect of God, or even, and everything is interconnected. So it's like Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of inner being. Everything is being part of everything else.
Yes.
So so for me, that was the exciting part, is that there wasn't anything of my experience or what I was seeing in movies that we were watching and books that we were reading that couldn't fit, that didn't have, wasn't an expression of one of these qualities. I'll admit there are a couple qualities that, had we had a longer alphabet, we would have added. For instance, we had grace and gratitude, so we didn't get generosity in there. And we had peace and play, so we didn't get patience in there. Had to stick it under hope. But it's this idea that spirituality is often described as like a journey or a seeking of wholeness and purpose and meaning, and also that it's a way of life. But what does that mean to say, oh, spirituality is a way of life? Well, it's a way of life if you have something that you can look to and anchor your experiences in and say, well, my spirituality is a way of life because I'm always looking, I'm grateful all the time, or I try to be grateful, or I try to be loving. So it's that way of finding practical applications so that your spirituality is really some place where the tire hits the road.
Right. So again, two questions coming up for me, or areas to talk about. The first is acknowledging what I would call the modern spiritual movement or evolution. And I actually see this as being for people, in faith traditions, and also for the nuns, Nones, who 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 want to think of spirituality as life and don't want to separate it as a category of life. And I think what I see in this movement, and I really believe that this event SDI has attested to, is that mysticism, which was once something very esoteric, something very much either relegated to special societies or was even considered threatening to mainstream. Mysticism, the ability to directly connect with the divine and the ability to potentially interact with it anywhere and at any time, that awakening to oneness, you might say, it's less and less something new. What I experience is it's becoming more and more integrated into common language, common consciousness, sort of like the way, this might seem like a strange analogy, but I remember being a young person and noticing words like meditation and yoga or mindful suddenly appearing in television shows and movies when it wasn't that long ago that those were just too obscure to
Mhm.
mean something to everybody. And so my point is that what I've come to believe is the great opportunity in the spiritual world today is not the awakening to oneness or the mystical consciousness of life. I think that's already rooted. The question is, now how do you live it? How do you move that into the world? Let's just assume God is everywhere always. Let's just assume we are living chapters in the book of life. And so I think there's something very powerful, despite the long history, yet to be discovered, because it seems to me younger generations don't want religion, but they do want guidance in a way that is both structured and fluid. And that's precisely what a language is, right? A language is what you've created, a filter for seeing the world, talking about the world, making sense of the world. Um, so, having said that, question one, do you and Frederick have certain hopes or aspirations for the spiritual language or the spiritual alphabet that you've created in terms of the next 50 years of its expression or existence? Or is this something that you feel has reached its climax and now you want to share where you're at? I don't think that's true. So, how do you relate your work with the spiritual alphabet to the future?
I think that one of the so you mentioned how there's these language, these things that come up in the culture, come up in common lingo. Um, there we started to we thought we spotted a spiritual renaissance beginning in the early 90s.
Yes.
It was when a lot of the publishers were putting out the sacred texts that hadn't been available to everyone, and suddenly they were streaming out of the publishing houses. Many of the teachers that are still prominent spiritual teachers were just beginning, were publishing a lot. And that was when we were putting together all these examples for spiritual literacy. And that was very much a time where teachings were coming out. But a lot of things did get said. I'm not saying that all the teachings have been covered so far, but a lot of things were said. And then we started to spot in the books that we were reviewing and the conversations we were having that there was a shift to an emphasis upon practice.
Mhm.
And I remember in the early 2000 or something, going to speak at a church in Connecticut. And the minister was a UCC church, very progressive. And he came up to me and he said, so when you're talking about everything, just remember that the question that I get most often from people in this congregation is, just tell me what to do.
Yeah.
And you've been a pastor, so I'm sure that's a familiar moment. And the point is, that was when I realized that it wasn't tell me what to believe, tell me what to think. It was tell me what to do. And that question could come from someone who was very religious, who wasn't very religious and thought themselves as spiritual, to someone that wasn't spiritual or religious at all, but they wanted something to do. So for us, I think what we see the alphabet as things to do.
So let me share a little. What's that?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted, so you ask about 25 going forward. We would just like people doing these things in more areas than the traditional spiritual, quote, arena, so that we move beyond these practices being applied by clergy and chaplains and spiritual directors and people that are professionals and or lay people, but also that they're showing up in healthcare, in education, in social work, parenting, all of these areas. So that it's not seen, so that the difference between sacred and secular that we used to talk about years ago, that's disappearing. And I'd like to see it disappear. We'd like to see it disappear. And one way it can disappear is for people to come at universal practices that could be applied by any person in no matter what they do or what they believe.
Yeah. I wanted to share an application that I'm interested in and that I actually have used recently. So, and this might be practical for people watching. So one thing that I do in a lot of the workshops that I run is I do like a wrap-up session. So how do you take this home? And one of the little pictures or models that I'll use is it's about 4 times. Okay, so it'll make sense in a second. I ask people to build a plan, and the plan is they need to have 4 practices in mind. 1, what am I going to do in the moment? I need a moment-to-moment practice for when stress comes up or there's disagreement or anger or sadness or whatever. Is it breath work? Is it mindfulness? Whatever. So something I can do quickly in the moment. The second is something that I do every day, and I commit 10 to 30 minutes. Typically, this is done alone. And again, is it reading your Bible or the Tao or doing sun salutations, right? So and then it's by the week, something you're going to dive into for at least an hour, but really more like an hour to 3 hours, much in the way people go to communities of spiritual practice. And then finally, once a season, and you take 1 to 4 days to be in deeper retreat. And it helps people just think in real concrete terms. Okay, I need an answer to each of these questions. What am I working on this month or this year? And what I love is plugging in the spiritual practices and saying to people, look, I want you to answer these 4 questions, but choose from these 37. And if you feel you've exhausted one because you've used, as you have in spirituality and practice, you've explored books, you've watched films, you've read quotes, and you've done the practices, okay, swap it out for a new one. And in that way, it's so fascinating that it can be both dynamic and confined at the same time. I love that. That wasn't really a question. It was more something I wanted to share for people listening. I do have another question though, but before I ask that question, did you want to add anything to my comment about really practical applications?
Well, I think that one of the our second book working with this alphabet is called Spiritual RX, Spiritual Prescriptions. And it's based upon the idea that people come to the spiritual life usually because some symptom shows up in their life. So they're happy and they want to express that, or they've just had a breakup and they're they're feeling lack of self-esteem, or they're feeling depressed, and or maybe they've had a diagnosis, or someone that they're close to has had a diagnosis. So there's something that has presented in their life, some symptom, and they know that they need a way to deal with it. And probably the way they dealt with it before could be improved upon.
Right.
And so one of the things that we have, and it's on the website, we have what we call the Spiritual RX prescriptions.
Right.
And that will say, if, say, you're undergoing stress, then one of the practices, and this is being proven by the mindfulness movement, that helps is practicing attention, practicing mindfulness of some kind. If you are experiencing boredom, then practices that bring out enthusiasm or put you in touch with enthusiastic people, that will help. One of my favorites of all of the practices is the practice of what we call the practice of you. And I thought of it this morning. We were listening to this speech at Spiritual Directors International from Sister Joan, and she talked about the importance of humility, and she talked about the grandiosity and the narcissism that has infected our culture and really changed not only the nation but individuals. And the practice of you is both. It's basically, I think I have printed, I was looking at it. Yeah, it basically says that you need to have both pride and humility. You need to be both assertive and yielding, because you are much more and much less than you probably think you are.
That's great.
So I love that idea that if the symptom that's presenting in your life is low self-esteem, then you need to practice, you need to do some practices that get you in touch with your authenticity, get you in touch with who you really are, and not who you think you are being defined by. But at the same time, if you have a problem with grandiosity, then it's good to do practices that remind you that you are not in charge, that there is greater force in the universe that is in charge, and it's not you. Or as somebody I was reading today said, and when you discover you are not it, you are not that something more. So you see, the point is that something comes up, some emotion, some experience, then you can actually apply practices as to either, we say in this chart that we have, they either enhance certain quality that you want. So practices of being present, practicing really being in the moment, enhances contentment. But it also counters or balances a tendency that you might have to live in the past, or be obsessed about the future. And so those being present practices are really prescriptions. They can really help. So that's what, and I think that's, again, one of the reasons why I think these applications need not be confined to a spiritual or religious audience or setting.
Mhm.
They can apply anywhere. We all have, no matter where you are, you're going to have problems with pride or low self-esteem. And so that's again why these are universal practices.
Hmm. So I know we probably need to wrap up in a few minutes, but I do have just a few last questions.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to affirm um, the kind of elegance and integrity of the model because it's not an allopathic model, meaning it's not symptom driven. The alphabet emerges out of the affirmative acknowledgement of a spiritual life. You don't even need the word God or religion or spirituality to relate to these qualities. They will open you up to those things naturally. However, they can be used in that kind of symptom relief manner. Nevertheless, it's a really great way to use that, and I think that spiritual prescription chart is something that I hope people listening to this will look up. Um, so I do have one little bit of a curveball question, might not be a climactic question before the final question, but I'm wondering about, as you know, the word literacy and how you've worked with that word and concept, which for some people is really an ideal term because it expresses intellect, it expresses education, it expresses a certain competence of language. And at the same time, I mean, you've been doing this long enough. I'm sure you've heard all kinds of comments. Why'd you call it an alphabet? Why'd you call it a prescription? Why'd you call it literacy? How do you relate to challenges about the alphabet being phrased around um, text in the sense, and I've heard this actually since we started working together. I've heard this, someone once said to me in a meeting, well, I kind of like referring to the alphabet more because that can be about the spoken word. That's about a language, a spiritual language. And she said, but I don't use the word literacy as much because I know that many traditions were oral traditions or don't value the book or see books as more sort of a more modern Western prize. I'm
Mhm.
curious, over the years, how have you responded to any and all challenges about the alphabet? Which challenges have you learned from and which have you responded to? I don't know, you can even share silly ones if you like, but
Well,
you
I
can't
think,
have something good without people picking at it or giving you feedback.
yeah, I think that I think that one of the first of all, we've had to kind of get people away from the idea that being literate means that you have mastered a certain amount of texts, or
Mm,
that spiritual literacy is not, even when people talk about religious literacy, they talk about, well, that means you understand the Bible or all these other sacred texts, and you've really you can understand and interpret and present them. This is not, this is not about mastering certain texts at all. This is really about a perception of life. And even I think maybe my favorite analogy is and this is out of date now, but maybe it's not completely. But there was a time when you had a camera and you used to put a filter on the end of the camera,
mhm.
and the haze filter, say. And now I suppose you can do that with your apps on your phone cameras. But the point is, you'd screw this little thing on, and then you would look at the same thing,
Right.
but it would be clearer. The colors would be more vibrant. You would see it differently.
Mhm.
And I think that's what spiritual literacy is. It's like a filter on your experience. It's a
Yeah.
way of looking at things to have them be brighter and deeper. And so that's one answer I would say about what is the how do we see spiritual literacy. It's really not a way of mastering certain things. It's a way of looking at the world. And so you're looking at it, and that's why we'll say movies, we make a list of the year, the end of the year, and we say these are the most spiritually literate movies. Now, this does not mean that the screenwriter has read some sacred text. This does not mean even that the story or the characters are conveying teachings. What it means is that when you look at this movie, you're going to see the world in a different way. And that different way is what spiritual literacy means. It's being able to see the signs of the sacred all around you.
Beautiful. Well, this is a wonderful place to end, but I am going to ask a kind of a fun last question.
All right.
This might be very difficult.
All right.
If you could choose one book and one film that you feel could help people to better understand not one quality of the alphabet, but the very principles behind spiritual literacy, to learn to see the world through a new filter. Is there a book and a film that you would pick out? I know there's hundreds, but could you pick one of each?
Well, I think that was the point of doing the book Spiritual Literacy. So I would say that is that you can't make it simple, because life is complex and life is diverse, and so it depends upon how you want to approach it. You want to approach it by looking at places. So then you might want to read nature writers, but you might want to read the prophets and the justice writers to understand community and action. So I think that's why we ended up not with, a little book. We ended up with 650 examples. And the same thing goes with like a film. Frederick has always resisted the top 10 list. We put out 55 to 60 films as our best of the year, because we have documentaries and we have foreign language and we have animated and as well as the so-called Hollywood features. But there is one film that we refer to it in spiritual literacy that has a story in it that are a part of it. There's an illustration from this film that I think really does capture spiritual literacy. And this is the film Smoke. And in the film, there's a guy named Augie who runs a tobacco store on a corner in Brooklyn.
Oh, is this with Harvey Keitel?
Yes, Harvey Keitel plays. And so every morning, Augie goes out and goes across the street and takes a picture of his corner store at 8 o'clock every morning. And then he develops them and puts them in notebooks. And one of his customers is a man who's grieving because his wife has died in a street violence. And he's a writer and he's blocked. And he comes into the store one day and Augie decides to show him his pictures. So he gets out these albums, and there's like a whole stack of them. And he shows them to this character, who then pages through them, 1, 2, and he says, they're all alike. And Augie says, oh, but they're not all alike. He says, you're never going to get it unless you slow down. And then they start looking at the picture slowly. And of course, there's different seasons. There's different people on the street. So there is something in that story that what Augie has is he has a spiritually literate view of his world. And his world happens to be his cigar store. but he has managed to see the riches and the variety and how all of life passes by, and he captures them with these photographs. So that's kind of your goal, I think, when you aspire to be spiritually literate, is you're really trying to see how the richness, the depth, the variety, all of the ways in which God is breaking into your experience and recognizing it as, this is a sign of the sacred. Oh, there's the sacred. Oh, it's over there. Oh, yes, it's in me. That kind of thing. So,
well, that's a wonderful way to end this interview. I don't know. Is there anything else we're doing? Did you still want to do?
I think we could have a little fun.
Okay.
We have a song.
Great. So thank you for the interview, though.
Okay.
And I think that was fascinating. And I'll let you just do the rest.
Okay. What I'm going to do is, and this will be a little not high production values, but a lot of fun. We're going to share a song, an alphabet song, and that was given to us by a folk singer.
Pay attention, walk with beauty. Being present, live your days. Show compassion, build connection. In devotion, make your praise. Love, enthusiasm, and faith. Grant forgiveness, share God's grace. Live with gratitude and share the hope that binds the human race. Hospitality is needed. Imagination brings us home. In your joy come seeking justice. For each one, not just for some. Display kindness as you listen. Love with love that never ends. Search for meaning as you nurture. Openness makes strangers friends. Foster peace and learn by playing. As you quest, may you revere. Welcome shadow, welcome silence. Teachers bring transformation near. Work for unity with vision. Wonder at the mystery. Yearn and follow your desires. Live God's Spirit zealously. God in things we love and cherish. God in places we hold dear. God in nature all around us. God in creatures far and near. God in our service, in our care, in our bodies and relations, in community we share. May we learn to read the sacred in our ordinary days, not to separate or sever us from others and their ways. Instead, eyes and ears to open, and our minds and hearts as well, to all places and all spaces where our God is pleased to dwell. To all places and all spaces where our God is pleased to dwell.
Thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoyed our little alphabet song.
Thank you. We'll see you at Spirituality in Practice.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.